And these constant references to eunuchs that we see surrounding Cleopatra are a very clear indication of how they see Antony at this point. A eunuch is the ultimate unnatural being to the Romans. It's anti-Roman, it's anti-nature, it's everything bad. While Cleopatra is clearly depicted as the cause of Antony's ruin, at the same time, Plutarch is able to engage in heroine worship and hagiography. Obviously, like so many before and after him, Plutarch was fascinated with the already mythologized character of Cleopatra, a character, I'll remind you, that was created in part by Cleopatra. He, in fact, managed to squeeze in nearly every anecdote that we know about her. We learn of only a few stories from other authors that are not included in Plutarch. Because of this, the so-called life of Antony really becomes the life of Antony and Cleopatra, or I would argue, the life of Cleopatra. And I have to say that I recently was on the web and I discovered an Egyptian tourism website that in part of its History of Egypt section says that Plutarch visited Egypt, which is something which is fairly agreed upon by scholars now, and that he wrote a biography of Cleopatra. And you know, that's a simplistic view, but it's absolutely correct. Okay? So I think that website's probably right. A critical question to ask is what Plutarch's sources were for his coverage of Cleopatra. There is no reason at all to think that Plutarch was familiar with Augustan poetry. Indeed, scholars question whether his Latin was sufficient for him to understand prose authors without assistance. And since none of our graduate students are in the room, I'll tell you that everyone now believes that Plutarch used translators for Latin, that he wasn't really capable of reading a lot of Latin himself. Don't tell the classics graduate students that. You have to know the original language. Of course, there was not much in the way of source material in Latin at this point anyway, because most of the Roman historians wrote in Greek. The Perioeci of Livy, which are little summaries of the lost books of Livy, preserve a few tidbits about Cleopatra which suggest a Plutarch-like approach. For example, Perioeci of 130 says Mark Antony luxuriated while he was with Cleopatra. The Greek language historians of Roman history, who might have been his sources, preserve less information on Cleopatra than Plutarch does. Obviously, he may have drawn on written sources that are no longer extant, as is clearly the case with some of his other work. But more importantly, oral tradition must have played an extensive role as a source for Plutarch. He admits this himself. And let me read to you just a little section here. Okay. So now this is section 28, and Antony and Cleopatra are in Alexandria. He says, there, indulging in the sports and diversions of a young man of leisure, he squandered and spent upon pleasures that which Antiphon calls the most costly outlay, that is, time. He wasted his time. For they had an association called the Inimitable Livers, and every day they feasted one another, making their expenditures of incredible profusion. At any rate, Philotas, the physician of Amphissa, used to tell my grandfather, Lamprias, that he was in Alexandria at this time, studying his profession, and that having gotten well acquainted with one of the royal cooks, he was easily persuaded by him to take a view of the extravagant preparations for a royal supper. Accordingly, he was introduced into the kitchen, and when he saw all the other provisions in great abundance, the 8 wild boars roasting, he expressed his amazement at what must be the number of guests. And the cook burst out laughing and said, the guests are not many, only 12, but everything that is set before them must be at perfection, and this an instant of time reduces. Okay, so blah, blah, blah. All right, so let me just repeat the critical part here, because this is so important to understanding this. Okay, Philotas, the physician of Amphissa, used to tell my grandfather, Lamprias, that he was in Alexandria at this time studying to be a physician, and that having gotten well acquainted with one of the royal cooks, he was easily persuaded him to take a view of the preparations for the supper. Okay? So, a guy who knew his grandfather made buddies with a cook in the kitchen at the palace at Alexandria, and that's his source for this information. Okay, so when an author repeats stories that his grandfather heard from some guy who knew some guy who worked in the palace kitchen 100 years earlier, we have to be rather cautious in the amount of credence we attach to a story. And I probably shouldn't have to say that. Ask any ancient historian worth their salt, and they will tell you that Plutarch can only be used as a source with extreme caution, both because of the stated purpose of the Lives, which is to exemplify morality, and because of his questionable source materials. You will never, for example, find a modern historian of Alexander the Great using Plutarch as a reliable source. But this is not the case with Cleopatra. The ongoing fascination with Cleopatra forces scholars and the public alike to be so completely desperate for information about her that they throw caution to the wind and use sources that the same scholars would reject for any other historical figure. The prevailing attitude seems to have been, and continues to be, we'll take anything we can get. But the problem goes much deeper than that. Recent scholars, as I mentioned earlier, are much more cautious about giving credence to stories as told by Plutarch and ancient authors. They recognize that the cute anecdotes are just that. They are fine for Shakespearean tragedy, but they should not find their way into books on history. Okay, in spite of that, someone I know recently did an experiment by putting a pearl into vinegar to see if it would dissolve, and may get tenure on that. Okay, what contemporary historians fail to see, though, is that the meta-narrative of their work is still firmly based on that of Plutarch. The primary framework onto which Plutarch hangs his story of Cleopatra is one of decline and fall. Antony's failure to succeed in some type of lasting accord with Octavian can be seen by Plutarch only as a decline. The impetus for the decline is the queen, and the nature of the decline is moral. And this is exactly what Plutarch tells us he's going to write. But modern historians don't challenge this framework. They don't analyze Antony's story as a function of politics, economics, or socioeconomic factors. While they've learned not to repeat the tabloid-like stories about Cleopatra, they still treat her as the cause of the fall of a great man. This, I believe, is what has kept scholarship from approaching the subject of Cleopatra in any critical way that might bring us closer to something like a truth about this period. The queen suffers doubly in historical analysis because she is actually depicted as having brought on the decline not only of Antony, but also of her own family. Perhaps never in recorded history has the need to talk, to say something, caused a deeper hardening of the intellectual arteries than the ongoing discussion of a historical account of the events surrounding the Roman Civil War between Octavian and Antony. My paper today is focused on how fiction can create and distort a reality to the point where even the most astute scholar is no longer aware of the sway of the fictitious. But I do believe that there is a future for Cleopatra studies, as this field has now been named. The character of the queen needs to be thoroughly analyzed in the context of Plutarch's writings. There is a need for a reevaluation of the translations of Plutarch, which of course is what most people use, with an eye toward the vocabulary he uses to describe decline and fall narratives. Work also needs to be done on Plutarch's attitude toward